We didn't have much money growing up. I grew up in the country with a brother and sister and quite a lot of cousins. This was a while back too, in the 1970s I believe. We didn't have cable TV and could barely get any television shows on our antenna. Listening to music or ball games on the radio was pretty much the extent of our outside entertainment. Other than that, we tended to spend a lot of time exploring the countryside. I was the youngest of the children in the family. After my siblings had left home, my family moved into a smaller house to save some money. It was even further out in the country than we had previously lived, but it provided a lot of new area for me to go out exploring in. Of course, all that exploring had to be done alone, since I was the only kid who was ever there, and no one really lived close to us. This happened on a pretty hot summer day. It was one of those days where it got hotter inside than it was outside. Plus, there was a pleasant breeze blowing outside, and there would be a lot of shade out in the hills, so I decided it was a good opportunity to do some exploring. I hadn't really had a chance to do much exploring before then in the hills around the new house. Going off alone wasn't exactly something I was used to doing. I have to admit that sometimes when you're out in the woods alone, it can be a little scary. I planned on being out there for a while. I walked up and down several hills, seeing all sorts of things out there, but something that really surprised me as I came over a hill was that there was a valley between it and the next hill, and there was this big old barn sitting right in the middle of it. I hadn't ever come across any old buildings or houses like that beforehand. I was quite a bit surprised. I was absolutely intrigued though, and I wanted to check it out no matter what. Although I had lived in areas previously where cattle grazed on the hills, there was nothing like that I had seen in this area. I figured that, combined with the old look of the barn, it must have been abandoned for quite some time now. I carefully made my way down the hill. I was anxious to get down there and take a look at this old structure. Once I had made my way into the valley, I still had to walk a little while in order to get to the barn. As I got closer to it, I had a better appreciation of just how large this building was. All I could figure is that they must have used to have cattle grazing there, and obviously quite a lot of it if they needed such a huge barn in that valley. The doors on the barn were really tall, but there were no locks or anything else on them to keep people out. There wasn't even a board like you see on the barns in movies. Rather than a handle, it had this knotted rope hanging off of each door, which I took for being a method of opening it up. I pulled on the rope. Although it made a lot of noise, the door opened easily enough. It made me think that it must have been opened recently, which worried me only a little. I had no way of knowing if that guess was true or not. There were a lot of bales of hay inside. The only light was coming from the door that I had just opened. The back of the barn and the upper lots were pretty dark. I made sure to open the door as widely as possible to get as much light into the barn as possible while I was looking around. I wasn't really looking for anything in particular. There were some tools scattered all around the barn. Some of them were on the wall, others were on what I guessed used to be a workbench. There were pitchforks and sickles and some other farmer things like that. All were pretty old, and just led me further to the conclusion that this place was abandoned and probably had been for a really long time. After doing a little bit of exploration on the bottom, I decided it was a good time to take a look at the upper lofts. I really didn't expect to find anything a whole lot more interesting than more hay, but I was young enough that part of me believed I might be able to find something valuable, like a lost treasure or maybe even an old diary or something like that. Anything that would just be interesting. I climbed up to a few of the lofts and I was right. There was nothing but hay in them. I wasn't going to check the one that was in the back of the barn, but since I hadn't found anything interesting, plus I wasn't exactly nervous due to the amount of time I had already spent in the barn, I decided against my better judgment to go ahead and check it out anyway. Each loft had this small staircase that led up to a trap door in the floor. I approached this one, trying to be as careful as I possibly could. It was really dark in the back of the barn, and I told myself I wanted to be careful not to slip or anything. I guess a part of me was now scared of the setting as well. This giant lonely barn in a lonely valley, and me climbing into a pitch-dark loft. It was a pretty terrifying setting. I slowly crept over the entrance to the loft, but decided to look around before going the rest of the way up. It was what I had done with the other lofts, but this one was a bit scarier, of course. It took my eyes just a moment to adjust. It was a little darker up inside. I looked around for a bit after they started to adjust. I was startled, though, when I looked off into the corner of the loft. I jumped when I saw what looked like a person crouching in the back corner. I had to rub my eyes for a moment because I was sure that whatever I was seeing, it must be an optical illusion. There couldn't actually be anyone there. I didn't have any time to react. The crouching figure hunkered down in the corner of that loft, jumped to their feet. The action was so surprising that it caused me to lose my footing on the stairs. I fell down the steps and landed, fortunately on the hay-covered ground. Groaning, I looked over at the trap door to the loft. I saw a foot slowly step out onto the top step. I lost it after that. I stumbled to my feet as quickly as I could. I didn't know who would be hanging out in a dark loft of an abandoned barn, but I didn't really want to stay there to find out. I raced out of there, not even bothering to shut the door as I ran past it. I didn't look back at all, not even once as I ran away from that barn. If whoever it was decided to follow me, I didn't want to know. I knew there was a dirt road that ran through these hills, and I just hoped I could find it. I had never run that hard, that fast, and that long in my entire life. I did eventually have to slow down because I was getting cramps in my sides. When I did look back. If the figure had ever followed me, he had either stopped long ago or fallen far behind. I kept walking, holding my sides until I made it to the dirt road. Then I followed it back to my house. I never told my parents about that incident. I would have just probably gotten in trouble for breaking into someone's barn. I still explored occasionally after that, but whenever I did not go into any abandoned buildings, no matter how tempting they might look. I used to move around a whole lot when I was a kid. It wasn't like across the country or anything like that, though. I lived in an area where several states were touching together, and all of my relatives lived in the general vicinity. We didn't really look at it as being different states, though. We all just thought of it as one big main hub area. In fact, even as I got older, I never really looked at these states like they were separate states with different laws and things like that. I did have to change schools several times, though. This was a more rural area, so a lot of the schools were older buildings too. When I was in 7th grade, I switched to a new school in a new area. This school was very, very old. In fact, my grandparents had gone to that very same school, and it wasn't very new back then either. There was a new high school being built though on the other side of town. It was right next to the old high school, and when it opened, the middle school moved into the old one, which was a much newer building than we had before. After the move, the old middle school just kinda closed up. Nothing new moved into its place, and they didn't really tear it down either. They just kinda boarded it up and left it there. It was out of town and by itself, so it just kinda became an eyesore. I'm sure teenagers probably broke into it to go drinking or smoking pot or something, and younger kids would make up strange stories about the place as if something scary had happened there. Then they would dare each other to go into it, or something like that. I never really thought much about it. I had only been in that school system for about a year. We moved several more times after that too. When I was in high school, I was on the school's quiz bowl team, and we had one of our many away games at that school system's high school. Our bus drove by that old middle school building, and I was surprised to see how badly it had deteriorated over just a few years. I could absolutely tell it had not been kept up at all. After our match, I got to talking with an old friend of mine on the team. I left a lot of schools behind, but I never really went back to one afterward. I also had developed a fondness for abandoned buildings, although my experience with them up to that point had only been old barns and sheds I had come across in the woods. I had never really seen an abandoned building quite so close to civilization. The real pull of it, though, was that it was a school that I had been in years before. How awesome would it be to get inside and see just how it had changed after it closed down? My friend Alex liked the idea of coming back later and checking that old building out. That was very fortunate for me since I didn't have a car to drive out there. He did, though. He also had some pot and thought it could be cool to be smoking in the school, even if it was an old, closed-down, abandoned one. It was Friday when we came back late that night. As I mentioned before, the building was outside of town, so we weren't worried about getting caught by someone. It was that fact that made it such a likely place for teenagers and the like to hang out in. Though I always thought they could just drive out into the woods, there were more than enough woods around in the area. We were able to drive up and went to the parking lot behind the school. We had to get through a gate to get to it, but that was easy enough too. We parked in the back so that if any police came driving by, they wouldn't notice the car in front of the school and get us in trouble. I was excited the entire time because I hadn't been in that building for 5 years now. I was curious just how much it had changed and how much I would remember. We snuck in through a broken door, which was probably what most teenagers who might have hung out in there did. Once inside, the first thing I noticed is how much smaller everything seemed. I know it sounds a bit cliche, going back to an old school and finding everything looking so small, but that was really what it was like. There was a ton of garbage on the floor, and things written on the wall and markers and stuff. The typical fare like Joey is gay and some other such nonsense. I don't know if it was because it was years ago, or if it was because I had been to so many different schools in my life, but it suddenly didn't seem very familiar. I still wanted to have a lot of looks around the place though. I had never been in the basement of the school. Alex really wanted to check it out. I had no problem with that, so I decided to go with him. It really wasn't much different than the rest of the school. There were hallways and doors, although a lot of the doors in the basement were locked. It was unlike the upper floors where most of the door frames didn't even have doors hanging in them anymore. I was interested in some of the stuff I saw written on the wall and went over to examine it. While I was doing this, Alex began walking down the hallway. He kept going up to the doors that had windows in them and looking into the rooms. At no point, however, did he try to open up any of them. I was only kind of half paying attention to what he was doing. "Holy shit!" I heard Alex exclaim. When I turned around to see him, I noticed a lot of things really quickly. First, it looked like someone was in that room that Alex was by, and they had just tried to grab him. They were not able to grip him though, and he immediately came running toward me. As he did, I noticed not one, but 2 men coming out of that room Alex had just been running away from. They started in our direction. I didn't know what was going on, but if Alex was running now, that was good enough for me to run too. I was still by the stairs, and I bolted up them. I ran, skipping steps all the way to the top. I checked to make sure Alex was right behind me following. He was. I didn't want to get caught by whatever it was about those men that freaked Alex out though, and thus I ran until I got to the door we had come in through. I just ran as fast as I could, trying my best to get to the doorway as quickly as I could to get out of the school. As I got there, I flew toward our truck. Alex was right behind me. I guess he was either a faster runner than I was, or he was running way faster because he was scared or something. He got there first and we hopped in. Alex started the car up. "Hey, what were those guys doing?" I asked Alex, but he refused to answer. He simply stepped on the gas on the car and took off. I looked behind us and saw that the 2 guys were now out of the school building. When our car bolted, they stopped following us. They just stared as we drove off. We didn't stop to even open the gate. Alex just drove right through it. As we drove off into the night, I kept asking Alex over and over what the hell was going on. Why was he so freaked out when he looked into that room? Why were these guys chasing us? But he refused to tell me at first. He drove the car until we got pretty far away from the school. He pulled into a Kroger parking lot and stopped the car. He still wouldn't tell me anything. He just kept breathing heavily and freaking me out. After a while, he finally calmed down enough to talk. Alex told me what he had seen in that room. He had seen two men, two guys he had never seen before, in that room. He had watched them as they were mutilating the body of a squirrel. The room was just filled with other dead animals. As he peered in, he got their attention by accidentally yelling in shock. I told him we had better go to the police about it, but he refused to drive me there. He just kept insisting that the best thing we could do was go home and forget about it. Over and over, there wasn't much I could do about it. It was his car and I couldn't do anything until I got home. When I did get home, right away I called in to the police of the town the abandoned school was in. I anonymously tipped them off to what I saw. Beyond that, I don't really know what happened. I hoped then, as I hope now, that they caught whoever was doing that. I don't know though. Back then, I couldn't follow the information on the internet because this was the late 80s and we didn't have that. It was also in a different town. I didn't see anything on the news though or ever read anything in the paper. Man, I don't get people. I really don't. I just don't understand these sick impulses some people get. The story takes place on one of those haunted hospital tours. I'm not going to mention the name of it though for several reasons. The first being that I'm pretty sure the staff of the tour were doing things to make it seem like the place was haunted, tricking people into believing supernatural things were happening. However, that's just the way I feel about the whole thing. I don't really have any proof and I don't want to get into any sort of legal trouble for accusing them. The other reason is because I absolutely did have a scary experience there, and if they really were faking some things, I don't want to give them positive publicity and attention either. Anyway, I went on this tour with a friend of mine. Now, in the beginning of the tour, you followed in a group of about 30 people or so. The tour guide took us to each floor and told us the supposedly scary things that happened in that hospital. I didn't know how much of it was real or fake at the time, although afterward all of the research I did showed that the stories were all likely made up. I had gone in there with a pretty open mind though. I mean, I really didn't have an opinion one way or the other on the existence of ghosts before. I was just curious, I guess, hoping to come to a conclusion afterward. It did get a little more interesting though, once we had visited all of the floors. Once that was finished with, they allowed everyone to break up and have open exploration of the hospital. The majority of the people went off alone and were trying to find any proof they could of the supernatural. For the longest time, there was nothing going on at all. Occasionally, I would cross by another person who was trying to contact a ghost in some way. Although I was open-minded to the possibility of ghosts existing, I felt the instruments that people used to try and communicate them were somewhat silly. Spirit boxes, other meters, and things they used to try and detect electricity. I don't know really. All I did know was the idea of using equipment to detect ghosts was silly, because it could never be tested for validity. I mean, what's the point of trying to detect electricity to find a ghost, when there's no evidence that ghosts cause pockets of electricity to begin with? Anyway, I was more interested in finding something I could see with my own two eyes. I had actually come across a few people who made some very interesting claims. There was a very large room that might have been a cafeteria or something. One of the other tourists seemed surprised when I came into the room. He claimed he had been calling out for someone for the past 15 minutes and asked if I had heard him. I told him that I hadn't. I didn't believe him for the simple reason that he seemed very surprised when I walked in, and also because he felt like he had to ask if I'd heard him. I think he was trying to make it seem like the spiritual presence of this hospital was silencing his voice or something. It just seemed a bit coincidental that this matched one of the exact stories the tour guide had told us. There were a bunch of other things that I was told by people, but unfortunately it was all secondhand. I was only hearing about other people having experiences, but I was not seeing anything for myself. I was a bit let down, to be honest. It also made me doubt not only their stories, but the existence of anything supernatural at all. I mean, it didn't make sense to me. All these others are experiencing these things they claim, conveniently when they're all alone, and yet I had never seen anything. Then, on the way out of the building, I was walking with a group of people. I was still feeling pretty let down at that point. As we were walking, someone grabbed my arm extremely roughly and tugged me through a doorway into another room. I turned to address the person who had done this, a bit surprised but not really angry. I mean, we're supposed to be in a haunted hotel, so I appreciate a good scare as much as the next guy. But when I turned around, there was no one in the room with me. My buddy who was with me came into the room after me. He thought I had stumbled or something. When I explained to him what had happened, he believed me right away. And yeah, I was telling the truth. We both searched that room up and down. There was only one doorway into it, and there was no one in sight at all. I was actually a little bit shaken up and kind of spooked when walking out of the hospital. My friend and I caught up with a group of people who were leaving. I don't know. Thinking back on that event does get me a little worked up and spooked sometimes, though I'm grateful that it happened. It's always interesting to have an experience that you just can't explain. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. I would also like to give a special shout out to my friend Killer Orange Cat, who is also a narrator here on YouTube that reads true scary stories. He has allowed me permission to use stories submitted to him in his subreddit in my videos. So if you like these stories, please be sure to go check him out, as he is a very good narrator as well, and he puts out content every week. If you guys enjoyed my narrating style and the content of this particular video, please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you do decide to subscribe, make sure to hit that bell button and turn notifications to all if you would like to be notified of every video I post in the future, although I post a video every day when I can, so if you just come back to the channel every so often, you'll not have missed very much. If you guys would like to get in contact with me for any reason, you can go ahead and take a look in the description below the video. You will find links to all of my social media, including my Gmail, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Send me a message on any of those, and I will try to read them as soon as possible. You can also send me a message on any of those to submit your own scary story experience for me to read in the video. If you do decide to submit a scary story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what the theme of the story is if it has one, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include proper grammar, and please include as much detail as you feel comfortable sharing, as that makes it much easier and more likely that it will end up in a video in the future. I also have 2 other channels if you like my voice, called Mr. Blue Skies and Darkest Hour respectively, where I do weekly true crime vids and monthly documentaries on dark things that happen in history. If you like my voice, check them out. Maybe those contents will be for you. Overall though, guys, I think that's pretty much it for now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.